Hello and welcome. In this episode, we dive into a topic that has sparked debates across the globe for decades: the United Nations Security Council reforms. Myth or reality? As nations call for a more inclusive, transparent, and representative council, the question remains: are these reforms achievable, or are they just political rhetoric? We'll explore the push for reform, the power dynamics at play, and what these changes could mean for global peace and security, especially for Nigeria and other African nations seeking permanent seats. If you're passionate about international relations, diplomacy, and global governance, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated on future content. Also, share this video to spread the word, and let's get more people involved in this important discussion. Now let's dive right in.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to take you to the heart of global power.
Ooh.
The United Nations Security Council. Have you ever thought about who gets to make those big calls?
Right.
About war and peace?
Yeah.
Well, that's the UN Security Council, or UNSC for short. We are going to dig into a scholarly paper that really breaks down the UNSC, its history,
Okay.
and the really hot debate about whether it needs a major makeover.
The UNSC really is like the ultimate power player in international relations. It's fascinating how much influence this one body has over global peace and security.
It really is. So let's get back to basics for a second.
Okay.
The UNSC was created way back in 1945, after that devastation of World War II.
Right.
I mean, can you imagine world leaders then thinking, okay, how do we prevent another global catastrophe?
And their solution:
Yeah.
create the UNSC with 5 permanent members.
Okay.
The victors of World War II, the US, UK, Russia, China, and France.
Wow.
Often called the P5.
The P5, it sounds kind of like a superhero team, right?
It does.
Except they have this unique power.
Yes.
The veto.
Yes.
Meaning
Yes.
any one of them can block any decision that the council tries to make.
Huge power.
Then there are 10 other countries that get to be non-permanent members for 2 years.
Right.
But the P5 always have the final say.
It's kind of like a club with exclusive membership.
Yeah.
And the P5 are the founding members.
Yeah,
They have a huge say in shaping the global landscape.
I bet.
Their responsibilities include everything from investigating and mediating disputes to imposing sanctions, deploying peacekeeping missions, and even authorizing military action.
Wow, that's a ton of power.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it.
It is.
The fate of entire nations rests on their decisions.
Right.
But here's the thing.
Yeah,
The world in 2024 looks very different than it did in 1945.
totally.
The paper we're diving into today really highlights this growing call for change.
Absolutely. This isn't just some academic debate. It's a real-world struggle for influence and representation.
Yeah, you know, the paper gave this example that really stuck with me.
Yeah.
Imagine you're India, a nation with over 1 billion people, a booming economy, and a major player on the global stage.
Right.
But you don't have a permanent seat on the council that makes decisions about global security.
Yeah.
How would that feel?
I think a lot of people would feel pretty frustrated.
Right.
And that's the argument for reform in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, and Germany are saying, hey, we deserve a bigger voice.
Yeah.
They're pointing to the fact that the current structure
Yeah.
doesn't reflect the realities of global power in the 21st century.
Right. And plus, when you look at it,
Yeah.
entire continents are underrepresented.
It's true.
Africa, with 54 countries, doesn't have a single permanent seat on the council.
Wow.
It just doesn't seem right, especially when so many UNSC resolutions are focused on African issues.
It's a major issue. The paper calls this lack of representation a democratic deficit and argues that it undermines the UNSC's legitimacy.
I see.
And that's not the only problem with the current setup.
Yeah. The paper brings up the veto power.
Right.
And how it can sometimes lead to complete gridlock,
Oh, yeah.
especially in crisis situations.
Exactly.
Take the Syrian civil war, for example.
Okay.
Russia has repeatedly used its veto power to block resolutions, even in the face of horrific human rights abuses.
It's a stark example of how the veto
Yeah.
intended to prevent rash decisions
Right.
can sometimes lead to inaction and a failure to protect civilians.
It's like 5 people in a room get to decide everything, even if the other 188 countries in the world disagree.
You're right, and that's why there are so many different proposals on the table for how to reform the UNSC.
Yeah, it seems like everyone agrees that something needs to change, but figuring out exactly what that change should look like, well, that's where it gets tricky.
Let's dive into those reform proposals. One of the most popular ideas is to simply expand the number of permanent members.
Right. So who are the contenders for these coveted seats?
Well, the paper focuses on the G4.
Okay.
That's India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan.
Okay.
They're all major economic powerhouses with growing influence on the global stage.
Adding them would definitely shake things up in terms of global power dynamics.
For sure.
But there's another layer to this.
Okay.
The paper also points out that there's a strong push to give Africa at least 2 permanent seats.
At least 2.
Oh, wow. So even deciding which African nation should get those seats is a whole other debate, right?
Exactly. Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt are all strong contenders, each with their own strengths and regional influence.
Right.
It just goes to show how complex the issue of representation is.
And then there's the whole debate about the veto power. I mean, is it really realistic to expect the P5 to give that up?
That's the million-dollar question. The paper does mention that France has proposed a veto restraint mechanism where the P5 would voluntarily agree not to use their veto in cases of mass atrocities.
Okay.
Like genocide.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
But would it actually work?
Yeah.
I mean, can you really rely on countries to voluntarily give up a power they've held for so long?
That's a key question that we'll need to explore further as we unpack the roadblocks to reform.
Okay, so we've got this powerful UN Security Council, calls for reform from all corners of the world, and a bunch of different ideas about how to make it more representative and effective.
Right.
But are any of these changes actually going to happen?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one that we'll tackle head on as we continue our deep dive.
Okay, let's do it.
All right.
That's good.
Okay. Let's face it, changing the rules of the game when you're already winning is a tough sell.
Right.
And the P5 hold a lot of power in the current system.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
The paper we're looking at really dives into these roadblocks to reform.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's a little daunting.
The biggest hurdle is the UN Charter itself, which basically lays out the rules for how the UN operates, including the Security Council.
Okay.
Any changes to the Charter require a 2/3 majority vote in the General Assembly.
Wow.
And the consent of all 5 permanent members.
So even if the vast majority of countries in the world want reform, any single one of the P5 can just veto it.
Exactly. It's like trying to pass a law that needs everyone in Congress to agree.
Right.
Including those who benefit the most from keeping things the way they are.
Talk about an uphill battle. And the paper points out that it's not just about the P5 either.
Right.
There are all these competing national interests that make reform even more complex.
That's right. Countries might agree in principle that reform is needed.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to the nitty-gritty details, things get a lot more complicated.
The paper gave the example of those potential permanent seats for Africa.
Right.
Even if everyone agrees that Africa should have more representation, there's a lot of disagreement about which specific countries should get those seats.
It highlights the challenges of regional representation.
Yeah.
Each country has its own priorities and alliances.
I see.
And sometimes those interests clash, even within a region.
So with all these roadblocks, is UNSC reform just a pipe dream?
Well,
Is real change even possible?
the paper acknowledges that comprehensive reform, the kind that would totally restructure the UNSC, is unlikely in the near future.
Okay.
The P5 hold a lot of power.
Yeah.
And they're not showing signs of letting go anytime soon.
Well, that's kind of disheartening.
Yeah.
But the paper also suggests that maybe smaller incremental changes are a more realistic goal.
Yes, and those smaller changes could still have a significant impact.
Oh.
Think of it like renovating a house. You might not be able to rebuild the whole thing from scratch.
Yeah.
But you can still update a few rooms.
Right.
And make it a more functional and comfortable space.
Okay, so maybe baby steps are the way to go.
Yeah.
Maybe we start with things like limiting the veto power in certain situations.
Right.
Or expanding the number of non-permanent seats to give more regions a voice.
Exactly. Those are the kinds of changes that might be more achievable in the short term, and they could pave the way for more substantial reforms down the road.
But here's the question that keeps nagging at me.
Okay.
Can the UNSC even with some tweaks here and there,
Mm-hmm.
really keep up with a world that's changing so rapidly.
That's true.
I mean, we're talking about new technologies,
Mhm.
shifting power dynamics,
Right.
climate change,
Yeah.
global pandemics.
Just a lot.
How can an institution designed for the 20th century effectively address the challenges of the 21st?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
And it's one that the paper leaves us pondering.
Okay.
As the global landscape continues to evolve,
Mm-hmm.
the pressure on the UNSC to adapt will only grow.
So what does a truly effective and representative UNSC look like in this new world? How can we ensure that global governance keeps pace with these rapid changes?
Those are questions worth grappling with.
Yeah.
And honestly, the answers are probably going to come not from some grand plan handed down from above,
Right.
but from a lot of difficult conversations,
Mhm.
compromises,
Yeah.
and maybe even some trial and error.
It makes you realize how important it is to stay informed and engaged with these issues.
It really does.
The future of global governance really does depend on us. The global community demanding change and pushing for a more just and equitable world.
And that brings us to the ultimate question.
Okay.
Is UNSC reform just a myth,
Mm-hmm.
or can it become a reality?
It's a question that we'll continue to explore as we dive deeper into this fascinating and complex issue. It's like we're standing at a crossroads.
Yeah.
One path leads to a UNSC stuck in the past and struggling to keep up with the changing world.
Right.
The other leads to a reformed council, one that's more inclusive, responsive, and equipped to tackle the challenges of the 21st century.
The question is, which path will we choose?
Right. I think the answer lies not just with world leaders and diplomats, but with all of us.
So what can we do? I mean, we're not exactly sitting at the UN negotiating table.
True, but remember, the UN is made up of member states.
Right.
And those states are made up of people like you.
Yeah.
Staying informed about these issues is a crucial first step.
Yeah. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by global issues, but even just understanding the basics
Right.
of how the UNSC works, why reform is important, and what the different proposals are, that's already a big step.
And once you're informed, you can start to engage. Talk to your friends and family about these issues, share information on social media, contact your elected officials, support organizations working for UN reform.
It's like that saying, be the change you want to see in the world. If enough people demand a more just and effective UN Security Council, it can create real pressure for change.
Absolutely. The UNSC is not some distant, untouchable entity.
Yeah.
It's an institution made up of people, and people can be influenced.
So let's recap what we've learned today.
The UNSC is a powerful body with a huge responsibility maintaining global peace and security.
A big one.
But it's also facing a legitimacy crisis.
That's right.
The current structure doesn't reflect the realities of global power in the 21st century. And that's led to a growing call for reform.
Exactly.
We've explored some of the key proposals for reform, from expanding the number of permanent members to limiting the veto power.
Right.
But we've also seen that there are significant roadblocks to change.
Yes.
From the entrenched interests of the P5 to the complex web of competing national interests.
It's complicated.
But even though comprehensive reform might seem like a long shot, smaller incremental changes are still possible.
They are.
And those changes can make a real difference in making the UNSC more representative, effective, and responsive to the needs of the global community.
Absolutely.
Ultimately, the future of the UNSC, and in many ways, the future of global governance itself, depends on us.
It does.
It depends on whether we choose to stay informed, engaged, and committed to pushing for a more just and equitable world.
Well said.
We hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the UN Security Council, the challenges it faces, and the potential for reform.
Yeah.
The next time you hear about a conflict in the news or a UN resolution being debated, you'll have a deeper understanding of the forces at play.
Remember, the world is constantly changing, and the UNSC needs to evolve along with it. The question is, will it adapt and become a beacon of global cooperation in the 21st century, or will it become a relic of the past?
Right.
That's a question we all need to consider.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep those brain gears turning, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of knowledge.
Thank you for watching this thought-provoking discussion on the United Nations Security Council reforms, myth or reality. If this topic resonates with you, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our future episodes. Don't keep this conversation to yourself. Share the video with others, and let's build a community that cares about global governance. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Use the comments section to share your views on the likelihood of UNSC reforms and their potential impact. Also, let us know the next topic or book you'd like us to explore. Thanks again for joining us, and see you in the next episode.